Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of pre-Civil War Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1853, the remote plantation known as Ashwood Estate became the center of events that would challenge not only the moral foundations of antebellum society, but the very understanding of human nature itself. What transpired over the course of 6 weeks between March and May of that year remains, to this day, one of the most extensively documented yet persistently inexplicable incidents in American criminal history. The Ashwood Estate sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of fertile bottomland in Trigg County, Kentucky, approximately 18 miles southeast of the Cumberland River and 23 miles from the nearest town of substantial size, Cadiz. The property had been in the Weatherford family since 1798, passed down through 3 generations of tobacco cultivation and what contemporary records describe as particularly harsh labor management practices. The estate employed an unusually large overseer staff, 11 men in total, each responsible for managing different sections of the plantation's operations. This administrative structure, uncommon for the period, would prove central to the events that followed. The region itself occupied a peculiar geographic position, situated in what locals called the Between Rivers country, a landscape of rolling hills, dense hardwood forests, and limestone caves that descended into unknown depths. The Kentucky-Tennessee border ran less than 12 miles to the south, and the area had long been known for its isolation and the fierce independence of its inhabitants. Winter in this region could be brutally cold, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing, while summers brought oppressive heat and humidity that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. In March of 1853, an unusual cold snap had persisted well beyond its typical seasonal duration, with frost appearing on the ground as late as March 22nd, according to meteorological records maintained by Dr. Silas Pemberton of nearby Hopkinsville. The Weatherford plantation operated under the management of Colonel Augustus Weatherford, a man described in the Cadiz Sentinel of February 1853 as being of stern disposition and old Virginia stock. The colonel, then 63 years of age, had inherited the estate from his father in 1829 and had expanded operations considerably, increasing both the acreage under cultivation and the enslaved population from approximately 70 individuals to nearly 240 by 1850 census records. What made the Weatherford operation distinctive, and what would become relevant to subsequent investigations, was the colonel's decision to house his 11 overseers in a single large structure known as the Overseers' Hall, a 2-story building constructed in 1847 specifically for this purpose. The Overseers' Hall stood approximately 400 yards northwest of the main plantation house, a deliberate positioning that allowed supervision of the slave quarters while maintaining what Colonel Weatherford described in correspondence as appropriate distance from the family residence. The building measured 60 feet in length and 30 feet in width, constructed of local limestone on the first floor and timber frame on the second. Each overseer maintained private quarters on the upper floor, while the ground level contained a common dining area, offices, and storage facilities. The structure featured 6 chimneys, serving individual fireplaces in each upstairs room, a design element that would become significant in the investigation that followed. It was into this environment that a young man known in plantation records only as Elijah arrived in November of 1852. The circumstances of his acquisition remain somewhat unclear, as conflicting accounts exist regarding his origins. The Weatherford Estate Ledger, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, indicates his purchase from a trading operation in Nashville, Tennessee, for the sum of $850, an unusually high price that the entry attributes to his unique physical condition and claimed literacy. Elijah was, according to multiple contemporary descriptions, an albino, possessing extremely pale skin, white hair, and eyes that witnesses variously described as pink, pale blue, or nearly colorless, depending on the lighting conditions. The Louisville Daily Journal of June 1853 published one of the most detailed physical descriptions of Elijah based on interviews conducted after the events. The article describes him as standing approximately 5 feet and 11 inches in height, of slender but strong build, with features that suggested mixed African and European ancestry, despite his albinism. More troubling still was the account's mention of his eyes, which multiple witnesses claimed seemed to change color or intensity depending on his emotional state, though this was likely attributable to the variable pigmentation common in albinism rather than any supernatural quality. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Elijah's physical distinctiveness, far from protecting him from the brutal realities of slavery, appeared to intensify the cruelty directed toward him. Records indicate that Elijah demonstrated unusual abilities almost from his arrival at Ashwood Estate. A diary kept by Sarah Weatherford, the colonel's eldest daughter, contains an entry dated November 18, 1852, describing a Sunday gathering at which the new arrival was brought before the family. Sarah, then 26 years old and educated at a female seminary in Lexington, wrote that Elijah recited passages from Shakespeare and discussed topics of natural philosophy with an eloquence that left the assembled family members deeply unsettled. The colonel, according to his daughter's account, declared that such learning in a slave was dangerous and ordered that Elijah be assigned to the hardest field labor under the supervision of the chief overseer, a man named Josiah Craddock. Craddock features prominently in the surviving documentation. Born in South Carolina in 1811, he had worked as an overseer on various plantations throughout the Deep South before arriving at Ashwood Estate in 1844. Contemporary accounts describe him as a large man, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing in excess of 250 pounds, known for his use of the whip and his conviction that enslaved people required constant physical discipline. The Cadiz Sentinel had published a letter from Craddock in 1849 defending the institution of slavery on biblical grounds, demonstrating both his literacy and his ideological commitment to the system he enforced. The other 10 overseers represented a range of backgrounds and temperaments, though records suggest that Colonel Weatherford selected men who shared Craddock's philosophy regarding labor management. Among them was Benjamin Thacker, age 34, who had previously worked on hemp plantations along the Kentucky River. Marcus Holcomb, the youngest at 23, came from a family of small farmers in eastern Kentucky and had been employed at Ashwood for only 8 months when the events occurred. The Reverend Silas Good, an unusual figure among the group, served as both overseer and plantation chaplain, conducting Sunday services for the enslaved population while maintaining discipline during the work week. His presence in the overseer's hall would later become a subject of particular theological speculation. From November 1852 through February 1853, Elijah worked in the tobacco fields under conditions that multiple sources describe as deliberately punitive. A letter written by Dr. Theodore Ashton, a physician from Cadiz who occasionally attended to medical needs on the plantation, mentions treating Elijah for severe lacerations on January 15, 1853. Dr. Ashton's letter, addressed to a colleague in Louisville and later submitted as evidence in the inquest, describes wounds on Elijah's back that he characterized as among the worst he had witnessed in 20 years of medical practice. More disturbing still was Dr. Ashton's observation that Elijah bore these injuries with what the doctor termed an uncanny composure, speaking little but maintaining eye contact in a manner that the physician found deeply unnerving. The first indication that something unusual was occurring appeared in mid-February 1853. According to testimony given by Martha Craddock, wife of the chief overseer Josiah Craddock, several of the overseers began complaining of vivid and disturbing dreams. Mrs. Craddock, who resided in a separate cottage near the overseer's hall, stated in her deposition to the Trigg County magistrate that her husband woke on the night of February 14th in a state of extreme agitation, claiming that he had dreamed of being consumed by white flames that produced no heat, but caused indescribable suffering. What makes this testimony particularly significant is that at least 3 other overseers reported similar dreams during the same period, according to statements collected after the incident. Benjamin Thacker's widow, Elizabeth, told investigators that her husband had mentioned recurring nightmares beginning around February 20th. In these dreams, Thacker claimed to see Elijah standing at the foot of his bed, his pale eyes glowing with an inner light, speaking in languages that Thacker could not identify but somehow understood. The content of these communications, according to Elizabeth Thacker's statement, involved pronouncements of judgment and references to ancient African deities, whose names her husband could not recall upon waking. She initially dismissed these accounts as the product of excessive whiskey consumption, a habit her husband had recently intensified. By early March, the situation at Ashwood Estate had begun to deteriorate in ways that contemporary observers found increasingly difficult to explain through conventional means. A journal kept by plantation tutor Harrison Fletcher, employed to educate the Weatherford children, contains entries describing behavioral changes among the overseers. Fletcher, a graduate of Transylvania University in Lexington, noted on March 3rd that Josiah Craddock appeared at breakfast with what Fletcher termed a peculiar 1,000-yard stare, barely touching his food and responding to questions with single-word answers or prolonged silences. Over the following 2 weeks, similar changes manifested in the other overseers, creating what Fletcher described as an atmosphere of inexplicable dread that seemed to emanate from the overseer's hall itself. More troubling still was the account provided by young Thomas Weatherford, the colonel's 12-year-old grandson, who lived at the main house with his parents and siblings. In testimony given in 1895, when Thomas was 54 years old, he recalled watching the overseer's hall from his bedroom window on the night of March 15, 1853. According to his account, he observed all 11 overseers emerge from the building shortly after midnight, dressed in their night clothes, and walk in single file toward the slave quarters. The moon was nearly full that night, Thomas recalled, and he could see the men moving with mechanical precision, their arms hanging limply at their sides. They stood in a semicircle outside the quarters for what Thomas estimated to be 10 to 15 minutes, perfectly still and silent, before returning to their hall in the same orderly formation. When Thomas mentioned this observation to his father the following morning, he was dismissed and told not to repeat such foolish tales. The Reverend Silas Good attempted to document what was happening in a series of letters to his brother, a Methodist minister in Nashville. These letters, preserved in the Tennessee State Archives, reveal a man struggling to reconcile his religious convictions with experiences that defied theological explanation. In a letter dated March 18, 1853, Good wrote that he had begun to question whether Elijah was a human being at all, or perhaps some form of divine instrument sent to punish the sins of those who profited from bondage. He described an incident that had occurred 3 days earlier, during which he had attempted to speak privately with Elijah about accepting Christ. According to Good's account, Elijah had responded by reciting passages from the book of Exodus in perfect Hebrew, a language Good had studied at seminary and knew Elijah could not possibly have learned. When Good demanded to know how he possessed such knowledge, Elijah reportedly smiled and stated that all languages were one language to those who had passed through the fire. What fire Elijah referred to remained unclear, though several witnesses later reported observing strange lights emanating from the slave quarters during the final weeks of March. A traveling merchant named Cornelius Webb, passing through the area on March 24th, provided testimony to the inquest describing luminous phenomena visible from the road that ran approximately half a mile from the plantation boundaries. Webb stated that he observed what appeared to be white flames rising from the vicinity of the slave quarters, flames that produced no smoke and seemed to dance in patterns that defied the wind direction. When he mentioned this observation at a tavern in Cadiz the following day, he was informed by locals that strange lights had been reported around Ashwood Estate for several weeks, though most attributed these sightings to foxfire or swamp gas from the nearby wetlands. Colonel Weatherford, according to his own testimony given at the coroner's inquest, became aware of serious problems among his overseers around March 26. He noted that production had declined significantly, with the overseers appearing increasingly disoriented and ineffective in their duties. When he confronted Josiah Craddock about the situation, the chief overseer reportedly broke down and wept, claiming that something was happening to all of them, that their minds were no longer entirely their own. Craddock stated that at night they would sometimes find themselves standing in places they did not remember walking to, or waking with their hands positioned in gestures they could not explain. Most disturbing of all, Craddock claimed that they were all dreaming the same dreams, witnessing the same pale figure, pronouncing judgment in voices that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The colonel, a practical man who attributed such claims to mass hysteria or perhaps poisoning from tainted food or water, ordered Dr. Ashton to examine all 11 overseers. Dr. Ashton's report, dated March 29, 1853, and filed with the county coroner, documented his findings in meticulous detail. Physically, the overseer showed signs of exhaustion, weight loss, and what the doctor termed nervous agitation, but no evidence of poisoning or disease. Their mental state, however, concerned him greatly. Each man, examined separately, described identical experiences: the progressive inability to sleep, the sensation of a presence in their rooms at night, the compulsion to perform actions they did not consciously choose, and above all, the recurring image of Elijah standing before them, wreathed in white flames, speaking words of condemnation in languages both alien and intimately familiar. Dr. Ashton, a man of science and skeptical disposition, noted in his report that he could find no medical explanation for these shared delusions. He recommended that the overseers be given a period of rest away from the plantation, suggesting that the isolation and perhaps some environmental factor unique to the overseers' hall might be contributing to their collective malaise. Colonel Weatherford, facing the practical impossibility of operating the plantation without his entire management staff, rejected this recommendation. Instead, he ordered that Elijah be removed from field work and placed in solitary confinement in a storage building, believing that physical separation from the enslaved population might break whatever influence the albino man seemed to exert. This decision was implemented on April 1st, 1853. According to multiple accounts, Elijah offered no resistance when taken to the confinement structure, a small stone building used primarily for storing tools and equipment. The overseer who escorted him, Marcus Holcomb, later told investigators that Elijah had smiled throughout the short walk and had spoken only once, saying that walls made of human stone could not contain fires that burned in the soul. Holcomb, the youngest and most recent addition to the overseer staff, would be the only one to survive the events of April 17th. The period between April 1st and April 17th witnessed a further deterioration in conditions at Ashwood Estate. With Elijah confined, many expected that the strange phenomena would cease. Instead, they intensified. The Weatherford family diary, maintained by Sarah Weatherford, contains increasingly disturbed entries describing the overseer's decline. On April 5th, she wrote that all 11 men appeared at Sunday services with what she described as the look of the condemned, their faces pale and drawn, their movements mechanical. The Reverend Good, who typically led these services, barely managed to complete the liturgy, his voice breaking multiple times as he struggled through familiar passages. Perhaps most inexplicable was the testimony provided by numerous enslaved individuals who worked at Ashwood Estate. Following the events of April 17th, several were interviewed by the investigating magistrate, though their testimony was recorded with the caveat that it came from witnesses whose legal status rendered them unreliable in the eyes of the law. Nevertheless, their accounts provided details that no other sources could offer. A woman named Rebecca, who worked in the main house as a domestic servant, stated that many of the enslaved population had known something terrible would happen. They had observed changes in Elijah that others had not noticed, specifically a quality she struggled to articulate, describing it as a light that seemed to shine from within him, growing brighter with each passing day. An elderly man named Moses, who had worked at Ashwood Estate for over 40 years and held a position of respect among the enslaved community, provided particularly detailed testimony. He stated that Elijah had told several trusted individuals that he had been chosen to serve as an instrument of reckoning, that forces older than the institution of slavery itself had selected him to demonstrate that certain debts must eventually be paid. Moses described Elijah's eyes during these conversations, noting that they seemed to contain depths that made direct eye contact nearly impossible to maintain. When asked if he believed Elijah possessed supernatural abilities, Moses responded that he believed Elijah had made himself available to powers that most men wisely avoided, and that such availability always exacted a terrible price. The meteorological conditions during mid-April 1853 added to the general atmosphere of unease. Dr. Pemberton's Weather Journal records a series of unseasonably warm days beginning April 12th, with temperatures reaching the mid-80s, highly unusual for the period. More striking still were his observations of unusual atmospheric phenomena, including multiple sightings of ball lightning and strange colorations in the sunset skies. On April 15th, he noted that the air had taken on a peculiar quality, simultaneously heavy and electrically charged, reminiscent of conditions preceding violent storms, though no precipitation fell. The night of April 16th witnessed the culmination of weeks of mounting dread. Multiple witnesses from neighboring properties reported seeing lights in the windows of the overseer's hall burning far later than usual, though what activities occupied the men inside remains unknown. Thomas Weatherford, watching from his bedroom window as had become his habit, stated in his 1895 testimony that he observed all 11 overseers standing at their respective windows, motionless, for hours. The moon that night was a thin crescent, providing minimal illumination, yet Thomas claimed he could see their pale faces clearly, all turned toward the small stone building where Elijah remained confined. What happened in the early morning hours of April 17, 1803, remained subject to interpretation despite extensive documentation. The physical evidence was undeniable. The overseer's hall burned to the ground, and 10 of the 11 overseers perished in the fire. The 11th, Marcus Holcomb, survived with severe burns that left him permanently disfigured. The circumstances surrounding the fire, however, defied straightforward explanation. The alarm was first raised approximately 3:30 in the morning by a field hand named Joshua, who slept in quarters within view of the overseer's hall. His testimony, recorded by the investigating magistrate, described being awakened by an intense brightness that initially led him to believe the sun had risen prematurely. Upon looking toward the source of the illumination, he observed the overseer's hall engulfed in flames of a color he struggled to describe, stating they appeared white or silver, rather than the typical orange and red. More disturbing still was his claim that the flames made no sound whatsoever, burning in complete silence until the structure's collapse approximately 20 minutes later. Colonel Weatherford and members of his household rushed to the scene but could do nothing to save the building or its occupants. By the time they arrived, the fire had achieved such intensity that approaching within 50 feet was impossible due to the heat. Yet here emerged one of the most perplexing aspects of the incident. Multiple witnesses stated that despite the fire's obvious intensity, it produced remarkably little smoke, and the flames seemed to consume the building with unusual thoroughness, leaving behind debris that several observers characterized as reduced to a degree of ash and powder inconsistent with typical structural fires. Marcus Holcomb was discovered approximately 30 yards from the burning building, his clothes and portions of his body severely burned, barely conscious and in obvious shock. Dr. Ashton, summoned immediately, treated his injuries and recorded Holcomb's initial statements, delivered in a state of delirium that the doctor attributed to pain and trauma. According to Dr. Ashton's notes, Holcomb repeatedly insisted that they had done it themselves, that all 11 of them had risen from their beds simultaneously, gathered downstairs, and deliberately set the fires. He claimed they had no choice, that something compelled them, that Elijah's voice had spoken in their minds, commanding them to accept purification through flame. When Dr. Ashton asked how Holcomb had escaped, the young overseer's response became increasingly incoherent. He claimed that as the fires spread, he had suddenly regained control of his own body and fled, but that the others had remained, standing calmly as the flames consumed them. Most disturbing of all, Holcomb stated that he had seen Elijah standing outside the building, bathed in the white fire but untouched by it, his pale eyes reflecting the conflagration with what Holcomb described as an expression of profound sorrow rather than triumph. The immediate investigation focused on determining the fire's origin and the fate of the 10 deceased overseers. The Trigg County coroner, William Hutchinson, arrived later that morning and began the grim task of examining the remains. His official report, filed April 19, 1853, documented findings that troubled him considerably. The bodies were burned beyond recognition, reduced to skeletal remains and ash, but their position suggested something deeply unusual. Rather than being scattered throughout the building as one might expect from individuals attempting to escape, 9 of the 10 sets of remains were found clustered in the central common area on the ground floor. The 10th, identified as belonging to Josiah Craddock based on location and certain physical characteristics, was found in his upstairs quarters. What makes this case particularly disturbing is Coroner Hutchinson's observation regarding the body's positioning. The 9 sets of remains in the common area appeared to be arranged in a semicircular pattern, facing toward a central point where evidence suggested a fire had been deliberately set. The positioning of the skeletal remains indicated that the individuals had been standing or sitting upright when the flames consumed them, showing no signs of the defensive postures or attempts to flee that characterize deaths in typical fires. Hutchinson noted in his report that his 30 years of experience as coroner had exposed him to numerous fire deaths, but never to victims who appeared to have remained stationary while burning alive. The question of how the fire started produced conflicting theories. The building contained multiple fireplaces and oil lamps, providing numerous potential sources of accidental ignition. However, the pattern of destruction suggested multiple points of origin, particularly in the ground floor common area where the 9 bodies were found. Fire damage patterns indicated that flames had burned with unusual intensity in specific locations, while leaving certain other areas comparatively less damaged, contrary to the typical spread patterns of accidental fires. Most significantly, investigators found evidence of accelerant use. Residue analysis conducted by a chemist from Louisville, Thomas Blackwood, identified traces of what he determined to be lamp oil, distributed in patterns suggesting deliberate pouring rather than accidental spillage. Blackwood's report, submitted to the coroner's inquest, concluded that the fire was almost certainly intentional, though whether set by the overseers themselves or by some external agent remained undetermined. The unusual completeness of the combustion, which Blackwood noted, exceeded what would typically result from wooden structure fires even with accelerant use, received mention in his report, but no explanation. The fate and whereabouts of Elijah became the investigation's central focus. When authorities checked the stone storage building where he had been confined, they found the door still locked from the outside, but the interior empty. The small structure had a single door and no windows large enough for human passage, yet Elijah was gone. A thorough search of the building and surrounding grounds revealed no evidence of how he might have escaped, nor any indication that the lock had been forced or the door opened from outside. Colonel Weatherford, in testimony given at the coroner's inquest held April 24, 1853, stated his conviction that Elijah had been released by someone sympathetic to the enslaved population, perhaps one of the field hands, and had fled during the confusion of the fire. He could offer no evidence supporting this theory, but insisted it represented the only rational explanation. When questioned about Holcomb's claims regarding Elijah's presence outside the burning overseer's hall, the colonel dismissed these as hallucinations produced by pain and shock. The testimony of Rebecca, the house servant, introduced alternative possibilities. She stated that on the morning of April 17th, she had entered the slave quarters to wake the domestic workers and had found Elijah sitting calmly in one of the sleeping areas, wearing clean clothes and showing no signs of having been confined for over 2 weeks. When she expressed shock at his presence, Elijah allegedly smiled and told her that locks and walls were illusions that bound only those who believed in their reality. He remained in the quarters throughout that day, making no attempt to hide, and disappeared that evening. Rebecca stated that no one saw him leave. He was simply there one moment and gone the next. Multiple enslaved individuals confirmed seeing Elijah in the quarters on April 17th, though their testimony, given their legal status, was not considered dispositive evidence. Moses, the elderly man who had provided earlier testimony, stated that he had spoken with Elijah for nearly an hour that afternoon. According to Moses, Elijah appeared profoundly exhausted, as though he had endured some terrible ordeal. When Moses asked what would happen next, Elijah responded that he had served his purpose and would soon depart, but that the fires he had kindled would burn long after his leaving. Moses understood this to mean not literal fires, but rather the flames of conscience and judgment that he believed Elijah had ignited in the hearts of all who participated in or profited from slavery. The investigation attempted to track Elijah's movements after April 17th, but found no credible leads. Rumors circulated throughout the region of sightings: a pale figure walking the roads at night, an albino man working briefly on riverboats, someone matching his description seen in Cincinnati and Chicago in Canada. None of these reports were verified, and Elijah effectively vanished from documented history after the fire at Ashwood Estate. The coroner's inquest concluded on April 28, 1853, with a verdict that satisfied no one. The official finding stated that the 10 overseers had died in a fire of suspicious origin, likely intentional, but that insufficient evidence existed to determine who had set the fire or under what circumstances. The possible involvement of the missing slave Elijah was noted, but the mechanics of how one confined man could have orchestrated the deaths of 10 overseers while escaping from a locked building remained unexplained. The verdict acknowledged Marcus Holcomb's testimony, but noted that his statements were given under extreme duress and could not be independently verified. Holcomb himself proved unable to provide additional clarity. As his physical condition stabilized over the following weeks, his mental state deteriorated progressively. Dr. Ashton's treatment notes from May and June 1853 document a young man consumed by guilt and terror, alternating between claims that he and his fellow overseers had murdered themselves under some form of compulsion and assertions that Elijah was not human at all, but rather a vengeful spirit sent to punish their sins. By July, Holcomb had become largely nonverbal, responding to questions with single words or prolonged silences. In September 1853, Marcus Holcomb was committed to the Kentucky Lunatic Asylum in Lexington, where he remained until his death in 1867. Records from the asylum, preserved in the state archives, show that he never fully recovered his faculties. He spent his final 14 years in a state of perpetual anxiety, sleeping poorly, speaking rarely, and showing extreme distress whenever fire or the color white was mentioned in his presence. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, who treated Holcomb at the asylum, wrote in an 1860 letter to a colleague that the patient remained convinced that he had witnessed something beyond natural explanation, something that had permanently damaged his capacity for rational thought. The broader impact of the Ashwood Estate incident extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. The Louisville Daily Journal published a series of articles in June 1853 examining the case and attempting to place it within various explanatory frameworks. Some writers attributed the events to mass hysteria, a phenomenon increasingly documented in medical literature of the period. Others suggested poisoning, perhaps from ergot fungus in grain stores, which could produce hallucinations and irrational behavior. The possibility of deliberate murder by person or persons unknown remained under consideration, though investigators could identify no plausible suspects beyond Elijah, whose means and opportunity appeared insufficient. Religious interpretations emerged immediately and persisted for decades. The Reverend Jonathan Edwards Harding, a prominent Presbyterian minister in Lexington, delivered a sermon in May 1853 that was subsequently published and widely circulated. Harding interpreted the Ashwood fire as divine judgment upon those who perpetuated slavery, characterizing Elijah as a modern Moses, sent to demonstrate God's displeasure with the peculiar institution. This interpretation gained traction among abolitionists, who cited the case as evidence of providence working against slavery. Conversely, pro-slavery advocates dismissed such interpretations as dangerous fantasies. The Cadiz Sentinel, in an editorial dated June 3, 1853, argued that attributing the incident to divine intervention or supernatural agency served to obscure what was almost certainly a case of arson and murder committed by a cunning criminal who had managed to escape justice. The editorial insisted that Elijah, far from being a spiritual instrument, was simply an unusually intelligent slave who had used his literacy and powers of persuasion to orchestrate a horrific crime. The fate of Ashwood Estate itself reflected the incident's lasting impact. Colonel Weatherford attempted to continue operations, but faced significant challenges. Recruiting replacement overseers proved difficult, as word of the mysterious fire had spread throughout the region, and few men were willing to accept positions at the property. The enslaved population, meanwhile, demonstrated decreased productivity and increased resistance, behaviors that some contemporary observers attributed to the emboldening effect of the overseers' deaths. By 1855, Colonel Weatherford had sold significant portions of the estate and drastically reduced operations. The Overseers' Hall was never rebuilt. Its ruins remained visible for decades, the blackened foundation stones gradually being reclaimed by vegetation. The colonel died in 1858, and his obituary in the Cadiz Sentinel made no mention of the 1853 fire, focusing instead on his service in the War of 1812 and his contributions to local agricultural development. More troubling still was the series of secondary incidents that occurred in the years following the Ashwood fire. Between 1854 and 1861, at least 4 other plantations in Kentucky and Tennessee experienced suspicious fires in overseer quarters or management buildings, resulting in multiple deaths. While each case had unique circumstances and no direct evidence linked them to the Ashwood incident, several contemporary observers noted disturbing similarities. The fires tended to burn with unusual intensity, produce minimal smoke, and leave victims who appeared to have made no attempt to escape. In 2 cases, survivors reported experiences of compulsion or shared dreams preceding the fires, though such testimony was generally dismissed as hysteria or fabrication. An academic investigation conducted in 1874 by Professor Martin Whitfield of Center College in Danville, Kentucky, attempted to comprehensively analyze the Ashwood case and its possible connections to similar incidents. Professor Whitfield, a historian with training in scientific method, spent 2 years gathering documentation, interviewing survivors and witnesses, and examining the physical locations where fires had occurred. His published findings, which appeared in the American Historical Review in 1876, acknowledged the case's disturbing elements, while attempting to maintain scholarly objectivity. Whitfield's analysis identified several consistent patterns across the incidents he studied. First, each involved management personnel on plantations, with reputations for particularly harsh treatment of enslaved people. Second, each fire occurred during periods of reported unusual behavior or psychological distress among the victims in the days or weeks preceding the incidents. Third, physical evidence at each site suggested fires of greater intensity and thoroughness than typical structural fires. Fourth, each incident included reports of unusual atmospheric or environmental phenomena in the vicinity around the time of the fires. Professor Whitfield proposed several theoretical frameworks for understanding these patterns. He considered environmental factors, including the possibility of unusual mineral deposits or geological features that might produce toxic gases or electromagnetic phenomena. He examined psychological explanations, drawing on emerging theories of collective hysteria and suggestion. He even tentatively explored what he termed paraphysical possibilities, acknowledging that certain aspects of the cases resisted conventional explanation while stopping short of endorsing supernatural interpretations. What makes Professor Whitfield's work particularly valuable is his extensive interview with Thomas Weatherford, conducted in 1875 when Thomas was 34 years old. By this time, Thomas had become a lawyer in Louisville and was willing to discuss his experiences at Ashwood Estate in considerable detail. He provided Professor Whitfield with the most comprehensive account of Elijah's appearance and behavior available from any source, describing aspects of the case he had been too young to fully understand at the time. According to Thomas Weatherford's testimony, Elijah possessed a quality that transcended his unusual physical appearance. Thomas described it as a presence or force that seemed to emanate from him, particularly in his final weeks at the plantation. Thomas recalled an incident in early April 1853 when he had encountered Elijah being led to the confinement building. Despite being 12 years old and socialized into the racial hierarchies of the antebellum South, Thomas stated that making eye contact with Elijah produced an experience he still remembered vividly 2 decades later. He described feeling as though Elijah could perceive not merely his physical form, but his innermost thoughts and fears, and that this perception came with a judgment that was simultaneously terrifying and strangely compassionate. Most significantly, Thomas revealed a detail he had never previously disclosed. On the night of April 16th, unable to sleep, he had crept from the main house and approached close enough to the stone building where Elijah was confined to peer through the small gap between the door and its frame. What he claimed to have witnessed remained with him for life. Elijah sitting cross-legged in the center of the small space, surrounded by a faint luminescence that Thomas insisted was not lamplight or moonlight, but rather seemed to originate from Elijah himself. The albino man appeared to be in a state of deep concentration or meditation, his lips moving soundlessly, his pale eyes open but unseeing. Most disturbing of all, Thomas stated that the air around the building felt charged, similar to the sensation before a lightning strike, and he heard what he could only describe as a low humming sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Professor Whitfield, despite his scholarly training and skeptical disposition, noted in his published work that Thomas Weatherford impressed him as a credible witness who had no apparent motive to fabricate or embellish his account. The professor acknowledged that Thomas's testimony included elements that defied rational explanation, but argued that dismissing such testimony solely on those grounds represented a failure of intellectual rigor. Instead, Whitfield suggested that the Ashwood case and related incidents pointed toward phenomena that existing scientific frameworks could not adequately address, phenomena that demanded further investigation rather than premature dismissal. The broader historical context of the Ashwood incident gained new significance following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Several former slaves who had lived at the plantation provided additional testimony in the 1870s and 1880s, now free to speak more openly about their experiences. Their accounts, collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents and later by historians, consistently portrayed Elijah as a figure of almost mythic significance within the enslaved community. An interview conducted in 1882 with Rebecca, the former house servant who had testified about seeing Elijah after his escape, provided additional insights. Then, in her 60s and living in Cincinnati, Rebecca stated that many enslaved people at Ashwood Estate had believed Elijah was chosen for a special purpose from the moment of his arrival. His albinism, rather than being viewed as a mere physical anomaly, was interpreted through African spiritual frameworks that several older individuals still remembered despite decades of separation from their ancestral cultures. These frameworks, Rebecca explained, recognized albinism as a sign of connection to the spirit world, marking individuals as potential intermediaries between physical and metaphysical realms. Rebecca further stated that Elijah had confided in a small group of trusted individuals, telling them that he had experienced visions since childhood, visions of fire that purified rather than destroyed, of judgment that came not from human hands, but from forces that predated human civilization. He claimed to have been prepared for his role through dreams and trances, and to have accepted his purpose despite knowing it would exact a terrible cost. When Rebecca asked what that cost might be, Elijah reportedly told her that those who serve as instruments of reckoning must themselves be consumed by the fires they kindle, that justice of this nature required absolute sacrifice from those who channeled it. The question of whether Elijah survived his disappearance from Ashwood Estate remained a subject of speculation and investigation for decades. Numerous alleged sightings were reported throughout the 1850s and beyond, though none were definitively verified. A particularly intriguing account came from a Union Army chaplain named Reverend Daniel Morse, who claimed to have encountered a man matching Elijah's description working as a hospital orderly in Tennessee in 1863. According to Reverend Morse's diary, preserved in the Library of Congress, this individual demonstrated remarkable medical knowledge and possessed a calming influence on wounded soldiers that Morse found extraordinary. When Morse attempted to learn more about the man's background, he provided only vague answers and disappeared from the hospital one night, leaving no trace. More disturbing still was a report filed by a Pinkerton detective in 1869 investigating labor unrest at an ironworks in Pittsburgh. The detective, Samuel Garrett, noted the presence of an albino worker who seemed to exert unusual influence over his fellow laborers, organizing them with remarkable effectiveness and displaying knowledge of legal and political matters far exceeding his presumed education. Garrett's report described attempting to interview this individual, who declined to provide a surname and claimed to be originally from Virginia. The man's eyes, Garrett noted, produced an unsettling effect that the detective struggled to articulate, describing them as simultaneously empty and infinitely deep. The worker disappeared before Garrett could conduct further investigation, and the ironworks experienced a mysterious fire 3 days later that destroyed the management offices, but claimed no lives. The academic study of the Ashwood case intensified in the early 20th century as universities developed more sophisticated historical and forensic methodologies. A particularly significant investigation was conducted between 1907 and 1909 by Dr. Helena Rutherford, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, who specialized in studying collective behavior and what was then termed mass suggestion. Dr. Rutherford approached the Ashwood incident as a potential case study in psychological phenomena, attempting to determine whether the shared experiences reported by the overseers could be explained through known mechanisms of suggestion, hysteria, or folie à plusieurs. Dr. Rutherford's research, published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1910, examined surviving documentation and conducted interviews with individuals who had known participants in the events. Her analysis concluded that while certain elements of the case could potentially be attributed to mass hysteria or suggestion, several aspects resisted such explanation. Particularly problematic was the physical evidence, the unusual burning patterns, the positions of the victim's remains, and the apparent spontaneity with which Elijah escaped a locked confinement structure. Dr. Rutherford acknowledged these difficulties in her published work, noting that a fully satisfactory explanation remained elusive. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Rutherford located and interviewed Marcus Holcomb's younger brother Charles, who had visited Marcus at the Kentucky Lunatic Asylum multiple times before his death in 1867. Charles Holcomb provided Dr. Rutherford with details of conversations that offered additional insight into Marcus's final years. According to Charles, his brother had consistently maintained that he and the other overseers had been compelled by some external force to set the fires that killed them, that they had no control over their actions, but retained full awareness of what they were doing. Marcus claimed he had survived only because whatever force controlled them had released him at the last moment, though he could not explain why he had been spared when the others were not. More troubling still was Marcus Holcomb's account, relayed through his brother, of the final moments before the fire. Marcus stated that all 11 overseers had gathered in the common area in the early morning hours of April 17th, each carrying lamp oil from their individual rooms. They had arranged themselves in a semicircle and in unison had begun pouring the oil on the floor and on themselves. Marcus described the experience as being present in his body but unable to control it, watching himself perform actions his conscious mind did not choose. He claimed that as they stood in their semicircle, Elijah's voice had spoken in all their minds simultaneously, not as sound, but as direct thought, telling them that the price of cruelty must be paid in the currency of suffering, that fire cleanses all debts. Charles Holcomb told Dr. Rutherford that his brother had been particularly disturbed by one final detail. As the fires began, Marcus claimed he had seen Elijah standing in the center of their semicircle, visible to all of them, yet somehow occupying space that should have been empty. Elijah had not been smiling or showing triumph, but rather appeared to be weeping, as though the act of justice he facilitated brought him no joy. Then, at the moment Marcus regained control of his body and fled, Elijah had simply vanished, and Marcus had glimpsed him outside the building, untouched by flames, his pale form disappearing into the darkness. The question of how to classify or understand the Ashwood incident remained contentious throughout the 20th century. Historical accounts tended to present it as either a case of slave rebellion and arson, a mysterious fire of undetermined origin, or an example of mass hysteria producing tragic results. None of these explanations fully accounted for the documented evidence, but each represented an attempt to fit the incident into familiar categories. An archaeological investigation of the Ashwood estate site in 1958, conducted by researchers from the University of Kentucky, provided additional physical evidence, but no definitive answers. Excavation of the Overseers Hall foundation revealed burn patterns consistent with multiple simultaneous points of ignition, supporting the theory of intentional fire setting. Analysis of soil samples showed unusually high concentrations of carbon and other combustion byproducts, suggesting fires that burned at higher temperatures than typical for wooden structures. Most puzzling were traces of what appeared to be vitrified material, similar to what might result from extreme heat, sufficient to partially melt stone, though no known accelerant available in 1853 could have produced such temperatures in an uncontrolled fire. The archaeologists also excavated the site of the stone building where Elijah had been confined. The structure's remains showed no evidence of forced entry or exit, supporting contemporary accounts that the door had remained locked. However, soil analysis around the building revealed chemical signatures that the researchers could not explain, including elevated levels of various minerals in patterns suggesting intense, localized heat or electrical discharge. The report noted these anomalies but offered no interpretation, acknowledging that available scientific knowledge could not adequately account for the findings. In 1978, a documentary film crew from the University of Louisville visited the Ashwood Estate site as part of a project examining Kentucky's antebellum history. Several crew members reported experiencing unusual phenomena during their 3-day visit, including equipment malfunctions, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and what the director described as an overwhelming sense of sorrow or dread that seemed to emanate from the area where the overseer's hall had stood. While such subjective experiences carry no evidential weight, they contributed to the site's reputation as a location of persistent strangeness. Local folklore surrounding the Ashwood incident evolved considerably over the decades. By the mid-20th century, the story had been incorporated into regional ghost narratives, with various embellishments and alterations. Some versions portrayed Elijah as a vengeful spirit who continued to haunt the area. Others characterized him as a practitioner of African traditional religions who had called upon supernatural forces to punish his tormentors. Still, others suggested he had been a white man who had deliberately darkened his skin and then used chemicals to lighten it, creating the appearance of albinism while orchestrating an elaborate revenge plot. These folkloric variations, while historically unreliable, reflected ongoing attempts to make sense of events that resisted conventional explanation. The historian James Montgomery, who studied Kentucky folklore in the 1960s and 1970s, noted that the Ashwood incident generated more diverse interpretive frameworks than almost any other historical event in the region. He attributed this to the case's combination of documented facts and irreducible mystery, creating a narrative space that different communities filled according to their own cultural frameworks and psychological needs. Perhaps the most thorough modern investigation of the Ashwood case was conducted between 1995 and 1998 by Dr. Patricia Edmonds, a historian at the University of Virginia specializing in slavery and resistance. Dr. Edmonds approached the case with both scholarly rigor and openness to its ambiguous elements, producing a comprehensive analysis that examined the incident within multiple contexts: the specific conditions at Ashwood Estate, broader patterns of slave resistance in the antebellum period, contemporary understandings of psychological phenomena, and the limited evidence suggesting possible paranormal elements. Dr. Edmonds's research published in 1999 as a monograph titled Fires of Reckoning, The Ashwood Incident and the Limits of Historical Explanation, presented several significant findings. First, she established that conditions at Ashwood Estate were indeed exceptionally harsh even by the brutal standards of antebellum slavery, with documentation of punishment practices that contemporary observers found excessive. Second, she verified that Elijah was indeed literate and possessed knowledge far exceeding what enslaved individuals typically had access to, though the source of his education remained undetermined. Third, she demonstrated that the shared experiences reported by the overseers prior to the fire followed patterns documented in legitimate cases of mass psychology, though certain aspects exceeded established parameters. Most significantly, Dr. Edmonds compiled a comprehensive list of similar incidents throughout the antebellum South, identifying 17 cases between 1847 and 1863, in which plantation management personnel died in suspicious fires preceded by reports of unusual psychological or behavioral symptoms. While she acknowledged that not all these cases necessarily connected to the Ashwood incident, the pattern suggested something more systematic than random occurrence. She proposed that these incidents might represent a form of organized resistance that utilized psychological warfare and possibly techniques drawn from African spiritual traditions to undermine the slave system. Dr. Edmonds was careful to note that her interpretation remained speculative, as definitive evidence for organized coordination between these incidents did not exist. However, she argued that dismissing such possibilities solely because they involved elements that seemed improbable reflected the biases of conventional historical analysis. She suggested that enslaved people's knowledge systems, particularly those preserved from African origins, might have included sophisticated understanding of psychology, suggestion, and possibly phenomena that modern science had yet to adequately investigate. The question of Elijah's fate and identity remained central to Dr. Edmonds's investigation. She attempted to trace his origins before arrival at Ashwood Estate, but found the documentary trail largely absent. The Nashville trading operation that sold him to Colonel Weatherford had no surviving records of where Elijah had been acquired or any details about his background. She did identify one potentially significant lead, a brief mention in a New Orleans newspaper from 1851 describing the sale of an albino slave who had reportedly been educated by a French planter in Haiti and possessed remarkable linguistic abilities. The description matched Elijah in several particulars, though definitive confirmation proved impossible. If this New Orleans reference did indeed refer to Elijah, it would place his origins in Haiti, a fact that Dr. Edmonds noted carried significant implications. Haiti's successful slave revolution and its traditions of voodoo practice might have provided Elijah with both ideological frameworks for resistance and potential knowledge of practices that could produce psychological effects on others. Dr. Edmonds was careful to distinguish between suggesting Elijah might have utilized psychological techniques drawn from voodoo and claiming he possessed supernatural powers, though she acknowledged the line between these interpretations could be difficult to maintain. To this day, researchers debate the fundamental nature of the Ashwood incident. The physical facts remain undisputed. 10 men died in a fire, 1 survived with severe psychological trauma, and an albino slave disappeared under circumstances that defied easy explanation. The interpretation of these facts, however, varies widely depending on the investigator's methodological assumptions and tolerance for ambiguity. Skeptical historians maintain that the incident was likely arson committed by Elijah with possible assistance from other enslaved individuals, followed by his escape during the confusion. The psychological symptoms experienced by the overseers are attributed to mass hysteria or possibly intentional poisoning, while Marcus Holcomb's more dramatic claims are dismissed as trauma-induced delusions. This interpretation has the advantage of requiring no appeal to unconventional phenomena, but it struggles to account for several documented details, particularly the mechanics of Elijah's escape and the unusual characteristics of the fire itself. Alternative interpretations propose that the case represents an example of genuine paranormal phenomena, possibly involving psychic abilities or spiritual forces. Proponents of this view point to the consistency of witness testimony, the physical evidence that seems to exceed conventional explanation, and the patterns of similar incidents suggesting systematic rather than isolated occurrence. Critics respond that such interpretations reflect wishful thinking or insufficient commitment to naturalistic explanation, and that gaps in evidence should not be filled with supernatural speculation. A third, interpretive approach, increasingly common among recent scholars, suggests that the Ashwood incident might represent phenomena that exist in the poorly understood boundary between conventional psychology and what might be termed paraphysical effects. This perspective acknowledges that human consciousness and its potential capabilities remain incompletely understood by modern science, and that dismissing documented anomalies solely because they resist current explanatory frameworks represents intellectual limitation rather than rigor. The current status of the Ashwood estate site reflects its complex history. Most of the original plantation lands have been subdivided and developed, though approximately 200 acres remain undeveloped due to difficult terrain and the presence of numerous caves. The foundation of the Overseer's Hall is still visible, now overgrown but recognizable to those who know its history. The site attracts occasional visitors, including historians, paranormal investigators, and individuals interested in the history of slavery and resistance. In 2015, a historical marker was installed near the entrance to the property, commemorating the events of 1853 and acknowledging both the cruelty of the slavery system and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the fire. The marker's text, carefully worded after considerable debate among historians and community members, describes the incident as a tragedy that resists complete explanation, noting that it serves as a reminder of slavery's violence and the enduring mysteries that sometimes surround historical events. The most recent scholarly investigation of the Ashwood case occurred between 2018 and 2021, led by Dr. Marcus Thompson of Howard University. Dr. Thompson approached the incident as part of a broader study of resistance practices among enslaved people in the antebellum South. His research, which included advanced analysis of surviving documents using digital humanities methodologies and consultation with specialists in African spiritual traditions, produced several noteworthy findings. Dr. Thompson identified previously overlooked connections between Elijah and a network of literate enslaved individuals who circulated information and possibly coordinated resistance activities across multiple states in the 1840s and early 1850s. While direct evidence of Elijah's participation in such networks remained circumstantial, Dr. Thompson documented patterns of communication and movement that suggested more organization among enslaved people than traditional historical narratives acknowledged. He proposed that Elijah might have been part of a sophisticated resistance movement that combined practical organizing with psychological warfare techniques designed to undermine the confidence and mental stability of those who enforced slavery. More controversially, Dr. Thompson consulted with practitioners of African traditional religions, including Vodou, Santeria, and various West African spiritual systems, to explore whether techniques existed within these traditions that might explain some of the psychological effects reported at Ashwood Estate. Several practitioners indicated that traditions of spiritual work focused on justice and protection had indeed been preserved and adapted by enslaved people, and that individuals with particular gifts could potentially affect the mental states of others through focused intention combined with specific practices. These consultants emphasized that such work was understood within their traditions not as supernatural violation of natural law, but rather as sophisticated application of principles governing consciousness and intention that Western science had yet to fully investigate. Dr. Thompson's research team also conducted geological and environmental surveys of the Ashwood Estate site, seeking to identify any natural factors that might have contributed to the reported phenomena. They found no evidence of toxic gases, unusual mineral deposits, or electromagnetic anomalies sufficient to explain the psychological symptoms experienced by the overseers. However, they did note that the property contained extensive limestone cave systems, some of which remained unexplored. One elderly resident of the area, interviewed in 2019, recalled family stories about strange sounds emanating from these caves during certain times of year, though he could provide no specific details about what might have caused such sounds. Perhaps most intriguing was Dr. Thompson's discovery of a document in a private collection in Louisiana, a letter dated 1854, written by a man identifying himself only as E., addressed to someone referred to as Brother M. The letter, written in remarkably educated prose, described having completed a task of terrible necessity, having served as an instrument through which ancient debts were collected. The author expressed profound weariness and a desire to find peace, noting that those who channel forces of judgment must themselves bear the weight of what they facilitate. While the letter's authenticity could not be definitively established and its connection to Elijah remained speculative, Dr. Thompson included it in his published research as a potentially significant artifact worthy of further investigation. The question of what actually happened at Ashwood Estate on April 17, 1853, remains fundamentally unresolved despite nearly 2 centuries of investigation and analysis. The physical evidence establishes that a fire occurred, that 10 men died in circumstances suggesting they made no attempt to escape, and that an 11th man survived with testimony of compulsion and shared experience. The documentary record confirms that the overseers experienced weeks of psychological deterioration prior to the fire, reporting dreams and experiences that defied conventional explanation. The testimony of multiple witnesses, both free and enslaved, describes Elijah as possessing unusual qualities and abilities, though the nature and source of these qualities remain disputed. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the violence of the deaths or the mystery of their circumstances, but rather the questions the incident raises about the nature of consciousness, the possibilities of human influence and intention, and the limits of rational explanation. The Ashwood case sits uncomfortably at the intersection of documented history and inexplicable phenomena, neither fully reducible to conventional understanding nor definitively supernatural. For those who knew the victims, the incident represented personal tragedy regardless of its ultimate explanation. Martha Craddock, widow of Chief Overseer Josiah Craddock, never remarried and lived the remainder of her life in modest circumstances in Cadiz, dying in 1871. Elizabeth Thacker, who lost her husband Benjamin, moved to Ohio with her 2 young children and eventually remarried, though family records suggest she never spoke of her first husband's death. The families of the other overseers scattered across Kentucky and neighboring states, carrying with them the trauma and mystery of what had occurred. For the enslaved people of Ashwood Estate, the incident held different meanings. Many gained their freedom in the chaos that followed the Civil War, and several left recorded testimony about their experiences. A consistent theme in these accounts is the conviction that Elijah had been an agent of justice, whatever the specific mechanisms through which that justice was enacted. Rebecca, in her final interview conducted in 1890, shortly before her death, stated simply that she had witnessed something that exceeded normal human capability, something that suggested forces existed beyond what most people acknowledged or understood. She maintained that Elijah had been chosen to demonstrate that no system of oppression, regardless of its apparent power, was immune to reckoning. The broader historical significance of the Ashwood incident extends beyond its specific details to what it represents about the nature of historical knowledge and the limits of evidence-based interpretation. Modern historical methodology prizes documentation, verification, and naturalistic explanation. The Ashwood case provides extensive documentation but resists definitive interpretation, offering evidence that seems to point simultaneously in multiple directions. This creates methodological tension between the desire for closure and the integrity required to acknowledge genuine uncertainty. Some scholars have argued that cases like Ashwood should be approached not as problems to be solved, but rather as reminders that historical reality sometimes exceeds our frameworks for understanding it. This perspective suggests that maintaining appropriate humility regarding the limits of knowledge represents better scholarship than forcing ambiguous evidence into predetermined explanatory categories. Others counter that such openness to mystery risks abandoning the standards that distinguish history from mythology, and that unexplained elements in a case should motivate more rigorous investigation rather than acceptance of inscrutability. The physical location where these events occurred continues to evoke strong responses from visitors. Multiple individuals who have spent time at the former Ashwood Estate site report experiencing unusual sensations or emotions, though these accounts vary widely and carry no scientific weight. A paranormal investigation team that visited in 2017 claimed to document various anomalies on electronic equipment, though their findings have not been independently verified and remain controversial within both skeptical and paranormal research communities. Local residents in Trigg County maintain varying relationships with the Ashwood history. Some view it as an important reminder of slavery's cruelty and the complex forms that resistance could take. Others prefer not to discuss it, viewing the incident as disturbing history best left undisturbed. A small number maintain family traditions of avoiding the former plantation site, based on beliefs passed down through generations that something dangerous or unresolved remains present there. The question of whether Elijah survived his departure from Ashwood Estate, and if so, how long he lived and what he did with the remainder of his life, has never been answered. The various alleged sightings reported over subsequent decades could represent actual encounters with the same individual, cases of mistaken identity, or entirely fabricated accounts. The absence of definitive information has allowed Elijah to become a somewhat mythic figure, subject to projection and interpretation that reveals more about those doing the interpreting than about the historical person. In African American folklore and historical memory, Elijah has been preserved in various forms. Some traditions portray him as a kind of folk hero who used mysterious powers to strike back against oppression. Others remember him more ambiguously, as a figure who channeled forces beyond his control and paid unknown prices for his role. Still others question whether the historical Elijah matches the legendary figure at all, suggesting that the real person has been lost beneath layers of myth-making and interpretation. Academic conferences and publications continue to examine the Ashwood incident periodically, usually in the context of broader discussions about slavery, resistance, and historical methodology. A 2023 symposium at the University of Kentucky brought together historians, psychologists, and scholars of religion to discuss the case and its interpretive challenges. The symposium produced no consensus regarding explanation, but did generate renewed interest in examining other similar incidents from the antebellum period, with several participants noting that the Ashwood case might be less isolated than previously assumed. Contemporary descendants of both the enslaved people and the free individuals involved in the Ashwood incident sometimes encounter each other in the shared space of historical reckoning. In 2019, a gathering was organized at the site by local historical societies, bringing together descendants from various sides of the story. Participants reported that the event was emotionally difficult, but ultimately valuable, providing opportunities for acknowledgement, discussion, and attempts at reconciliation across the generational divides created by slavery and its aftermath. The psychological impact of the Ashwood incident extended beyond those directly involved to affect broader perceptions of slavery and resistance. Abolitionists seized upon the case as evidence that the system of human bondage generated forces that would inevitably turn back upon those who perpetuated it. Pro-slavery advocates dismissed such interpretations while nevertheless exhibiting increased anxiety about managing enslaved populations, particularly those individuals perceived as unusually intelligent or influential. The incident contributed to the climate of fear and tension that characterized the final decade before the Civil War. Medical and psychological professionals of the period attempted to analyze the case within available theoretical frameworks. The concept of mental contagion or collective delusion was invoked frequently, though practitioners acknowledged that the Ashwood incident seemed to exceed typical parameters of such phenomena. Some physicians proposed physiological explanations, including theories about environmental toxins or epidemic disease affecting neural function. None of these theories adequately accounted for the specific patterns of experience reported by the overseers or the physical evidence associated with the fire. The question of whether justice was served by the events at Ashwood Estate admits no simple answer. From one perspective, 10 men died horribly, whatever their moral culpability for participating in slavery's violence. From another perspective, these deaths might represent a form of accountability that the legal and social systems of the time would never have imposed. The ambiguity of the incident's mechanisms, whether human agency, psychological influence, or something else entirely, complicates moral evaluation, as does the impossibility of knowing what the overseers might have thought or felt in their final moments. Elijah himself, if the various testimonies regarding his demeanor and statements can be trusted, appeared to view his role with complexity rather than simple vengeance. Multiple witnesses recalled him expressing sorrow about what would occur, suggesting that he saw himself as an instrument of necessity rather than an agent of personal revenge. Whether this interpretation reflects the actual historical person or represents projection by witnesses attempting to make sense of inexplicable events remains impossible to determine with certainty. The fires at Ashwood Estate burned for less than an hour on the morning of April 17, 1853, but their light continues to illuminate questions about human nature, consciousness, justice, and the limits of knowledge. The case resists the closure that both historical methodology and human psychology tend to prefer, instead offering enduring mystery that invites ongoing investigation and reflection. Perhaps this is appropriate for an incident that challenged fundamental assumptions about what is possible and what forces might operate beneath the surface of documented reality. In the more than 170 years since the Ashwood incident, numerous attempts have been made to forget, explain, or mythologize what occurred. None have fully succeeded. The case remains in that peculiar category of historical events that are too well documented to dismiss, but too strange to comfortably integrate into conventional narratives. It serves as a reminder that history, particularly the history of profound human suffering and resistance, sometimes generates events that exceed our frameworks for understanding. The stone foundation of the Overseers' Hall, still visible among the overgrowth at the former Ashwood Estate site, marks the location where 10 men died in circumstances that remain disputed and mysterious. The nearby fields where enslaved people labored under brutal conditions have been reclaimed by forest, and the structures where they lived have long since disappeared. What remains is memory, documentation, and questions that persist across generations. For those who approach the Ashwood incident seeking simple answers or definitive explanation, the case will inevitably disappoint. For those willing to sit with ambiguity and acknowledge the limits of certain knowledge, the incident offers something more valuable, an opportunity to contemplate the mysteries that lurk within historical record, the possibilities that exist beyond conventional understanding, and the ways that profound injustice can generate responses that transcend ordinary human capability. whether through psychological sophistication, spiritual power, or forces that resist categorization entirely. The final words belong perhaps to Moses, the elderly enslaved man who knew Elijah and spoke with him on the day the overseer's hall burned. In testimony given in 1878, 40 years after his emancipation, Moses reflected on what he had witnessed. He stated that he had seen many things in his long life, things that exceeded easy explanation, and that Elijah had been among the most mysterious. When asked directly whether he believed Elijah possessed supernatural abilities, Moses paused for a long time before responding. Finally, he said that he believed some people open themselves to forces that most keep distant, and that such opening allows both great power and great suffering. He believed Elijah had been such a person, and that the fires at Ashwood represented the visible manifestation of forces that operate always and everywhere, usually unseen. Whether Moses spoke truth or merely offered the wisdom of age and experience shaped by trauma and survival remains, like so much else about the Ashwood incident, impossible to determine with certainty. What can be stated definitively is that on April 17, 1853, 10 men died in a fire of disputed origin and mysterious character. An 11th man survived with testimony that challenged rational explanation, and an albino slave called Elijah disappeared into history, leaving behind more questions than answers. The flames that consumed the overseer's hall burned brightly enough to illuminate these basic facts, but cast shadows deep enough to hide the ultimate truth of what transpired and why. Those shadows persist, and perhaps always will, reminding us that even the most thoroughly documented history retains mysteries that resist resolution and events that exceed complete understanding.